The Richard J. Daley Center doesn't care who you are. The building just stands there on Washington Street, all brutalist concrete and cold glass, indifferent to the people filing in and out with their briefcases and their grievances. I've driven past it 100 times over the years. Never thought I'd be walking into it wearing a Dickies jacket and work boots. I got there early, found parking on Dearborn, fed the meter, walked the 2 blocks in the November cold. The lobby smelled like floor wax and old paper. Security didn't give me a second look, just the belt, the boots through the scanner, the nod. Courtroom 174, 17th floor. I found it without asking anyone. When I pushed open the door, I counted maybe 8 people in the room. Gianna was already seated at her table on the left side, next to Shane Bradley. Bradley was everything you'd expect from a LaSalle Street divorce attorney. Navy suit, French cuffs, hair that looked like it cost more to cut than my monthly phone bill. He was leaning over talking to Gianna, one hand on the table, posture loose with confidence. She saw me first. Her expression didn't change much, but her chin lifted just slightly. That particular movement I'd learned to read over 7 years of marriage. Bradley turned to look at where she was looking. He laughed. Not a snicker. An actual laugh, short and sharp, directed at no one in particular, but loud enough to fill the space between the 2 tables. He leaned back toward Gianna and said something low. She covered her mouth with 2 fingers. I walked to the table on the right side, pulled out the chair, and sat down. I didn't look at them again. My attorney, Nora Fry, arrived 3 minutes later. She set her bag down, opened her folder, and gave me a quick nod without saying anything. We'd already talked through everything that mattered. There was nothing left to discuss. Bradley stood up. "Counsel," he said, the way people say words when they want you to feel the distance between you. Nora didn't look up from her folder. "Shane." The bailiff called the room to order. At 9:02, Judge Arnold Lawson came in from the side door. Late 60s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that has stopped being surprised by anything in a courtroom. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file in front of him. He read for a moment, then he looked up. "Jacob Hurst." "Yes, Your Honor." He looked at me the way judges look at people they haven't formed an opinion of yet. Then he looked back at the file, turned a page, turned another. He stopped. He reached for the phone on the side of his bench, pressed a button, and spoke quietly to whoever was on the other end. 30 seconds, maybe 40. He set the phone down and looked at both tables without expression. "We're going to take 5 minutes before we proceed." Bradley frowned. "Your Honor, if there's a scheduling, 5 minutes, Mr. Bradley." The side door opened. 2 men in suits entered. Not court staff, not sheriff's deputies. They carried the specific kind of stillness that comes from federal credentials. One of them carried a manila envelope. They positioned themselves against the wall to the right of the judge's bench and said nothing. Bradley turned to look at them, turned back to look at me. I was looking at the wall straight ahead. Behind me, I heard Gianna shift in her chair. The room had changed, not in any way you could point to exactly. Same fluorescent lights, same worn carpet, same smell of old paper, but everyone in it understood without being told that whatever this proceeding had been 60 seconds ago, it was something different now. Judge Lawson folded his hands on the bench and waited. I kept my eyes forward and let the silence do what silence does when there's nothing left to hide behind. I met Gianna McFarland at a cookout in Bridgeport, a mutual friend, nothing arranged. She was standing near the back fence with a paper plate and a can of soda, and she laughed at something someone said. A full laugh, no filter. That was the first thing I noticed. She was renting a room at the time, working a front desk position at a property management office on the north side. Nothing glamorous. She took the bus to work, packed her lunch most days, called her mother every Sunday. We dated for 14 months before I proposed. We were married at a small venue in Lincoln Square. 62 people, decent food. Her cousin sang something off-key, and everyone pretended not to notice. For the first few years, the marriage was solid. Not perfect, nothing is, but honest. We argued about money sometimes, about whose turn it was to deal with the landlord, about small things that feel big when you're tired. Normal friction. She worked. I worked. We built something together, piece by piece. I've been doing telecommunications installation for 9 years by then, mostly commercial contracts, office buildings, medical facilities, infrastructure upgrades for businesses across the metro area. The work takes you into places most people never see. Server rooms, utility corridors, the mechanical floors of high-rises. You learn how buildings actually function, not how they present themselves. It's physical, technical, and it pays well when you know what you're doing. I'd moved up to lead installer and was pulling in close to 28 an hour with overtime. Gianna made a lateral move into a financial services firm on LaSalle Street around year 3. Entry-level operations, mostly data entry and document processing. The job itself wasn't significant. The environment was. She started dressing differently. That was the first thing. Not dramatic, but deliberate. She'd come home talking about people at the office the way you talk about characters in a show you've just discovered, the senior managers, the client meetings she occasionally sat near, the way deals moved through that building. She wasn't part of any of it yet, but she was watching closely. By year 4, comments started, small ones at first. She mentioned once that a colleague had a car she'd pointed at admiringly, then looked at my Ford Focus with something she didn't bother to disguise. Another time, at dinner with her work friends, she laughed at a joke I made and then immediately qualified it for the table. He's being funny, as if they might not have understood on their own. I filed that away. By year 5, she'd been promoted twice. She was attending client events, occasionally traveling for the firm, and spending money at a pace that didn't match what I knew she was bringing home. New clothes, regular salon appointments, a gym membership at a place on Michigan Avenue that charged more per month than my truck's insurance. When I brought it up, she said she needed to maintain a certain appearance for work. That conversation ended without resolution, which I also filed away. The distance between us wasn't explosive. It built the way rust builds. Slow, consistent, invisible until it isn't. She started coming home later, stopped asking about my day in any way that suggested she wanted an actual answer. When we were in the same room, she was usually looking at her phone. When we went out together, which became rarer, I could see her scanning the room, assessing, comparing. I'm not a man who chases explanations. I watched, I cataloged, and I waited to understand what I was actually looking at. By year 6, I understood this wasn't a rough patch. This wasn't stress from work or a phase she'd come through. She had recalibrated who she wanted to be, and that version didn't include a telecommunications installer from the South Side who drove a 10-year-old Focus and brought his own lunch to job sites. I wasn't a failure to her. I was just no longer the right prop for the image she was constructing. I didn't confront her about it. Not then. Instead, I started paying attention in a different way. Gianna started working late with more consistency around month 3 of year 6. Not every night, but enough that it stopped being an exception and became a pattern. Her texts were always brief, running late, wrapping up, nothing that invited a response. I didn't push. By that point, I already knew that asking questions she didn't want to answer would only produce a version of the truth she'd constructed in advance. What actually moved things forward was mundane. When Gianna had first joined the firm on LaSalle, she was added as an authorized user on a credit card under my name, a holdover from when she was between jobs and needed a card with a limit behind it. Neither of us had ever gotten around to canceling it. The physical statements still came to the house addressed to me, with her transactions listed underneath. She had stopped paying attention to that detail. I started going through the statements carefully, not looking for anything specific, just reading them the way you read something when you finally decide to actually look at it. Hotels in the Gold Coast, dinners at restaurants she'd never mentioned, a charge at a spa in River North on a Saturday, when she'd told me she spent the day helping a coworker move. The amounts weren't outrageous, but the pattern was clear. She had a second life with a budget attached to it, and part of that budget was running through a card she'd forgotten was still connected to me. I photographed every statement going back 8 months and said nothing. The dinner conversation happened on a Wednesday. She brought it up herself, unprompted, while we were eating, eyes on the table, voice measured. She said she wasn't happy, that she had changed and the marriage hadn't changed with her, that she needed to be honest about that. I set down my fork and looked at her. She kept talking. Fulfillment, ambition, not wanting to waste years. None of it landed on anything concrete. I said, okay. She waited for more. It didn't come. After a moment, she picked up her plate and took it to the sink. That night, I called my older brother, Joseph, and asked for the name of the attorney he'd used in an estate dispute a few years back. He sent me the contact, Nora Fry, office in the loop. I met with her the following Monday before my first job of the day. I put the photograph statements on the table, walked her through the dates and the discrepancies, and told her what I knew about Gianna's role at the firm, expense reporting, corporate card access, vendor reimbursements. Nora listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few direct questions about the scope of Gianna's financial access at work. Then she said something that reframed the entire situation. She told me that in a divorce proceeding, both parties are required to provide full financial disclosure. That meant subpoenas, document requests, and access to records that people rarely hand over voluntarily. She said that given what I described about Gianna's position and the spending patterns I documented, it would be worth bringing in a forensic accountant during discovery, someone who knew what to look for when personal expenses and corporate reimbursements existed in the same environment. She had someone in mind, a man named Albert Haynes, former auditor, now working independently on cases exactly like this. I asked what that meant if something irregular turned up. Nora said it would depend on what the record showed, but she said it plainly. If Gianna had been running personal expenses through corporate accounts, that wasn't a divorce issue. That was a different category of problem entirely. I drove to my job site in River North, parked the truck, and sat for a minute before getting out. Gianna thought she was the one who had planned ahead. Gianna was served on a Thursday morning. I had arranged it deliberately, a process server at her office building on LaSalle, just after 9, not at home, not on a weekend at work, in the lobby, in front of the security desk. Nora had advised me it was within my rights to choose the location, and I chose it without hesitation. She called me 4 times before noon. I let every call go to voicemail. The first message was controlled, asking me to call her back, saying we needed to talk. The second was less controlled. By the third, the composure she'd spent years building in that office environment had started to crack. She said I was being dramatic, that I was making something out of nothing, that she had just told me she was unhappy and I had turned it into a federal case. That last phrase, I noted, was more accurate than she intended. She hired Shane Bradley within the week. I knew the name. He had a visible presence in Chicago legal circles, the kind of attorney whose reputation was built on making the other side feel outmatched before the first filing. Nora told me not to be concerned. I wasn't. What neither Gianna nor Bradley anticipated was the scope of the financial disclosure request Nora submitted as part of discovery. It was comprehensive, personal accounts, any accounts she held interest in, and all employment-related financial records relevant to income and asset calculation. Standard procedure in a divorce proceeding, but thorough. Bradley pushed back on parts of it. The court granted the request in full. Albert Haynes went to work. He was methodical in a way that reminded me of good installation work. No shortcuts, no assumptions, every connection verified before moving to the next. He spent 2 weeks going through the records that came back through discovery, corporate card statements, vendor reimbursement logs, expense reports filed under Gianna's credentials going back 3 years. He called me on a Tuesday evening and asked if I had time to meet the following morning. His voice was even, but there was a weight behind it that hadn't been there before. We met at a coffee place on Wacker. He put a folder on the table and walked me through it without editorializing. The numbers told the story on their own. Gianna had been submitting personal expenses as corporate reimbursements for at least 2.5 years. Hotel stays, dinners, travel that had no corresponding business purpose. The amounts individually were small enough to avoid triggering automatic flags, but cumulatively across 31 months, the total was significant. She had also listed a vendor in the system that, when Albert traced the registration, led back to an LLC filed under a name neither he nor I recognized, with a registered address that turned out to be a UPS store in Wicker Park. She had been billing the firm for services from a company that didn't functionally exist. Albert said that what he was looking at wasn't a divorce issue. He said it plainly and without drama, the way accountants deliver difficult news. It was potential wire fraud, and depending on whether any of the transactions crossed certain thresholds, it could involve federal statutes. He asked if I wanted him to refer it to someone with the appropriate authority to act on it. I asked him if he thought that was the right move. He said that wasn't his call to make, but he said the documentation was clean, the pattern was clear, and whoever reviewed it would reach the same conclusion he had. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told him yes. Nora made the referral through the proper channels the following week. Not a complaint, not an accusation, but a disclosure of findings from a court-ordered financial discovery process. The kind of thing that lands on the right desk and gets reviewed by people whose job is exactly that. I went back to work. A commercial retrofit in the South Loop. 3 days of cable runs through a building that hadn't been updated since the 90s. Physical work, concrete, and conduit. Nothing that required thinking about Gianna McFarland or Shane Bradley or what was now moving through channels neither of them knew existed. She sent me one more message that week. It said she thought we could still handle this like adults, that there was no reason for things to get complicated. I read it once and put the phone back in my pocket. The weeks between the referral and the hearing date had a specific quality to them. Everything on the surface looked the same. I went to work, came home, ate, slept. Gianna was still in the house for part of that period, which was its own particular kind of tension. We moved around each other like people sharing a waiting room. Polite enough to avoid confrontation, distant enough that there was nothing left to pretend. She had retained Bradley and was clearly following his advice. Minimal direct communication, everything routed through attorneys. That was fine with me. The less she talked, the less she could miscalculate. Bradley filed a response to the divorce petition that was aggressive in the standard ways, contesting asset division, questioning the valuation of certain property, flagging my income trajectory as a point of dispute. He was building a case designed to maximize her take and minimize mine. Textbook. Nora reviewed everything, made notes, and told me none of it was unexpected. What Bradley didn't know, and what Gianna apparently hadn't told him, or possibly didn't fully understand herself, was that the financial disclosure process had already produced something well outside the scope of a divorce proceeding. The referral Nora had made was sitting with people who worked on a different timeline than family court. They didn't move fast. They moved thoroughly. I found out through Nora, about 3 weeks before the hearing date, that the referral had been received and was under active review. She told me in her office, same flat tone she used for everything. She said I should expect that by the time we appeared in court, there was a possibility, not a certainty, but a real possibility, that there would be additional parties with interest in the proceedings. I asked what that looked like practically. She said it might look like nothing until it didn't. I drove home thinking about that, about Gianna sitting across from Bradley in some conference room on LaSalle going over her strategy, convinced she understood the board she was playing on. She had spent years learning how that environment worked, how money moved, how appearances were managed, how people with the right posture and the right attorney could walk out of a room having taken more than they came in with. She had never considered that someone had been paying attention the entire time. 2 weeks before the hearing, she moved out. No announcement. I came home from a job in Evanston and half the closet was empty, some boxes gone from the second bedroom, the Audi missing from the driveway. She sent a text saying she was staying with a friend and would be in touch through Bradley's office. I read it standing in the kitchen, still in my work jacket. I ordered food, watched about 40 minutes of television, and went to bed. The night before the hearing, Nora called to walk me through the sequence of events. She told me to arrive early, dress practically, say nothing unless directly addressed by the judge, and let her handle Bradley. She had dealt with him before and described him as someone who performed best when his opponent engaged with the performance. She intended to give him nothing to perform against. I asked her directly, were we going to be okay? She said the documentation we had built was as clean as anything she had taken into that courthouse. She said Albert Haynes would be available by phone if the judge needed clarification on the financial findings. And she said that whatever happened with the other matter, the referral, was out of both our hands now. I thanked her and got off the phone. I set out my clothes for the morning, the same Dickies jacket I wore to most job sites, dark war pants, boots I'd cleaned the week before. Nothing pressed, nothing purchased for the occasion. I had thought about it briefly, whether I should dress differently for the courtroom, and decided against it. I wasn't going to perform anything for Shane Bradley or anyone else in that room. What I was what I'd always been, a man from the South Side who showed up and did the work. I made coffee, checked my bag one more time, documents in order, phone charged, keys on the counter, and went to sleep at 10:30. Whatever was going to happen in that courtroom was already in motion. Had been for months. Every log, every statement, every date I'd written in a notebook and handed to Nora. It was all sitting in a file with my name on it, waiting for a judge to ask for it. Bradley had laughed when he'd seen people like me walk through that door before. Tomorrow, he'd see what happened when the quiet ones had done their homework. Judge Lawson looked at both tables for a moment without expression. Then he spoke. Mr. Bradley, I'm going to ask you to hold your position for a few minutes while I review something that was brought to my attention this morning. Bradley straightened in his chair. Your Honor, if there's a procedural matter, there is. I'll get to it. The two men who had entered and positioned themselves along the wall hadn't moved. They weren't sheriff's deputies. Their credentials were federal, and the way they stood made that clear without any of us needing to ask. One of them had already exchanged a brief word with the bailiff when they came in. The other held the manila envelope at his side and watched the room. Gianna had turned in her chair to look at them when they entered. She hadn't fully turned back. Bradley leaned toward her and said something low. She responded without moving her eyes from the man against the wall. Whatever she said back to him, it made him go quiet. Lawson spent about 4 minutes reading. The courtroom held its silence the way courtrooms do when everyone understands that talking would be a mistake. I kept my eyes forward. Nora had her hands flat on the table in front of her, relaxed. The judge set the papers down and removed his glasses. It appears that in addition to the divorce petition before this court, there is a matter of financial investigation involving one of the parties that is currently under review by federal authorities. He said it the way you'd read a weather report. Factual, no emphasis. The findings from the discovery process in this case were referred through appropriate legal channels approximately 6 weeks ago. I've been informed this morning that the review has produced sufficient grounds for further action. He looked at Gianna directly. She was completely still. Miss McFarland, I'm going to recommend that you speak with your attorney privately before we proceed any further today. Bradley was already on his feet. Your Honor, my client was not notified of any. She's being notified now, Mr. Bradley. One of the two men stepped forward and placed a document on the edge of the defense table. He didn't hand it to Gianna. He set it down in front of Bradley, who looked at it, then looked at the man, then sat back down with the specific stillness of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the next few hours. Gianna picked up the document. She read the first paragraph. Then she set it back down on the table and stared at a point somewhere in front of her that wasn't anything in the room. The charges outlined were federal wire fraud, misappropriation of corporate funds, and filing of fraudulent expense claims across a period of over 2 years. The LLC registered to the UPS store address in Wicker Park was named explicitly. The cumulative amount was listed clearly in the second paragraph. It was not a small number. Lawson gave them 15 minutes. Bradley took Gianna to the hallway. I stayed seated. Nora poured herself a small cup of water from the pitcher on our table and said nothing. One of the federal officials remained in the courtroom. The other stepped out. I looked at the wall. I thought about the cookout in Bridgeport where I'd first met her. The paper plate, the full laugh, the can of soda, the woman who took the bus to work and called her mother on Sundays. I didn't spend long on it. That woman and the one in the hallway talking to her divorce attorney while a federal document sat on a courtroom table. There wasn't much left connecting them. When they came back in, Gianna's posture had changed. Not broken. She wasn't the type, but diminished like a structure that hadn't collapsed but had lost something load-bearing. Bradley addressed the judge. He acknowledged the federal matter, confirmed that his client would be cooperating with a separate investigation, and stated that given the circumstances, they were prepared to discuss a revised position on the divorce settlement. Nora stood up. She was concise. The asset division she outlined was straightforward and well documented. The credit card records, the discovery financials, the discrepancies between Gianna's disclosed income and her actual expenditure patterns. Nora laid it out in about 6 minutes without raising her voice once. Bradley objected twice. Lawson overruled both. The settlement was entered into the record before noon. Gianna kept the Audi. I kept the house. The joint financial obligations were divided cleanly, with no ambiguity. She walked away with significantly less than she had walked in expecting, and with a federal case that had nothing to do with the divorce now attached to her name. Bradley gathered his files without looking at me. Gianna stood up from her chair, and for a moment she and I were facing the same direction, both looking toward the exit. She turned and looked at me directly, not with anger, with something more like recognition. The delayed kind, the kind that arrives too late to be useful. I held her look for a second. Then I picked up my bag, nodded to Nora, and walked to the door. Outside, the November air on Washington Street was the same cold it had been when I had parked on Dearborn 2 hours earlier. I buttoned my jacket, checked the meter on my phone, and started walking back to the truck. I had a job in Hyde Park at 2 o'clock. Cable installation, 4th floor of a medical building. Nothing complicated. I'd be done before 5. I texted my brother, Joseph, 3 words on the walk back. It's done. Thanks. He replied with a single word. Good. I put the phone in my pocket and kept walking. Jacob is a man who came from a humble background and built a stable life in Chicago. He married a woman who once had nothing, and over the years watched her completely change as she climbed in her professional environment. She became more distant, spending beyond what she disclosed, and eventually being unfaithful to the marriage while planning to leave with an advantage in the divorce. If there's one key word for today's narrative, it's underestimation. Gianna spent years building an image, believing that appearance and environment define power. Her attorney laughed because he saw simple clothes and assumed weakness. Both of them made the same mistake. They confused lifestyle with capability. Jacob didn't need to look like anything. He just needed to be prepared. And that's what this story is really about. The danger of judging someone by what they seem to be, especially when that person chooses to stay silent. Because silence isn't always passivity. Sometimes it's a sign that someone has already made every decision they needed to make. Well, That's where our video comes to an end. I really hope you have enjoyed your time here. Don't forget to leave your like, your comment, and also subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for all the support. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you.